Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Lindros. I'm a Senior Principal Curriculum Developer here at Oracle. Welcome to this Oracle Learning Library live event. Today we're talking about WebLogic Server 12.1.3 using whole server migration with dynamic clusters. I imagine that the first thing you might be thinking right now is whole server migration, that's nothing new. Well, it is new for dynamic clusters, which were introduced in WebLogic Server 12.1.2. Because both of these topics existed in previous releases of WebLogic Server, much of this is going to be reviewed. First, I'm going to review dynamic clusters, then I'm going to review whole server migration, and then I'm going to show you how to configure both of them to work together. First, we're going to talk about server templates. Server templates enable you to define common attributes that are applied to a group of server instances that are based on a template. So there are certain attributes that are common and other ones that are calculated. And one of the big benefits of this is that you can make a change to a server template in one place, and then that change is realized across all of the different instances that are based on that template. You configure a server template with the administration console by going to the domain structure, environment clusters, server templates node. Click New to create a server template. Name it and click OK. And hold on, let me get my pointer. And then you'll be brought back to this screen and you'll have your server template in there. You click on it and that will bring you to its configuration page. Configured cluster is the new name given to the original way of configuring a cluster. Where each server is manually configured. And even though it's a configured cluster that works the way that it worked before dynamic clusters and server templates, a configured cluster can be based on a server template. But the primary use for server templates are for creating dynamic clusters. Again, the template defines common attributes. You define a number of servers that go across a couple of machines. The template gets associated with the cluster. And servers are generated across the machines of the cluster. Here's an example of a dynamic cluster configuration. You start off with a couple of physical machines. You've got machine 1 and 2, and then you've got 3 machines on the bottom, fast machine A, B, and C. To configure a dynamic cluster that spans the fast machine A, B, and C machines, you configure a template with a listen port starting at 8999, which means the first server's port is going to be 9000 because it increments by 1. And here are the configuration properties for the dynamic cluster itself. You specify the maximum number of servers for the cluster, a prefix for the cluster for each server, so that each server will be served dash whatever the ID is. And then you've got calculated listen ports and calculated machine associations. So calculated listen ports will give you 9000, 9001, 1002, and increments by 1 for each server. the machine name match expression is set to fast start. And so what that does is it tells WebLogic to only start up these servers on machines, only select machines that start with the name fast. And here we show the servers getting generated across the machines in the cluster. And as these two machines did not start with the name fast, they're not used. Now let's review whole server migration. First, we're going to assume that there is an admin server that's not part of the cluster, it's just not shown. So you've got a cluster defined with 4 different machines with a node manager running in each machine. The first server starts, and because it's the first server of the cluster to start, it becomes the cluster master of the server. And because it's also a member of the cluster, it contacts the leasing service and renews its lease with a timestamp that it has to periodically update, which is used to determine if the server is available or not. Other servers in the domain also start and contact the leasing service and update their leasing information with their timestamps. The cluster master on server 1 periodically checks the leases in the leasing service, and leasing service can be in memory like it's listed here, or it can be in the database in the table. So it keeps checking the leases, and eventually machine 2 crashes, and along with it server 2 becomes unavailable. So the first thing that happens is server 1 is checking the leases, and the cluster master notices that the lease for server 2 has expired. The first action it takes is to try and start up the server where it was originally running. But because machine 2 is not available, it picks one of the candidate migration machines and starts the server over there, on machine 4 in this case. And when server 2 starts up, it again contacts the leasing service, renews its lease, and continues processing. Here are some preliminary steps for configuring whole server migration. Use the configuration wizard to create a new domain. Then you configure your operating system user to use sudo to execute certain commands. Because the node manager needs to be able to run ifpig and arping to be able to migrate IP addresses. And then it's a best practice to synchronize the time between all the different machines. This is one way to do it. There's multiple different ways that you can synchronize time. Whatever works at your shop is okay. Also, whole server migration will work okay without time being synchronized, but it could be iffy, so it's just the best practice to keep your time synchronized. Then you configure your node managers for every node manager in your domain. You have to open up the node manager.properties file. Let me get the pointer out again. In file, we specify the interface, which we've got eth0 here, and then you specify a pool of IP addresses. And here we got 192.0.2.20 through 30. And so this set of IP addresses are configured telling Node Manager, you are able to automatically and dynamically enable and disable or activate and deactivate these IP addresses on the machine that you're running on. And then this is where it uses these ifconfig commands to bring these IP addresses up and down, determine based upon whatever server it is that it needs to start or shut down. And then we just specify a net mask at the end of it. After your node managers are configured, then you start them up. And it uses commands in this server migration server migration folder that's found in domain home bin. So you need to add that to your path, and then you start up the node manager in domain home bin. In this case, we're showing how to start up a per domain node manager. So most of that's pretty much review. And here's how you would configure a dynamic cluster for whole server migration in the administration console. So you already have two machines, you've got your node managers running, and you need your WebLogic configuration to match that, to match whatever's physically running in your environment. So you have to configure two machines to match the settings of your machines, and then configure node managers for each machine to match the settings of the node managers that you have running. Then you configure a dynamic cluster across your machines. We didn't talk about this, but when you create a dynamic cluster, a server template can automatically be created and associated with it. And then you configure your server template for the proper settings to be able to work across your server. So here we've got, we don't specify the machine because in the cluster we've got machine selection being done via the name match expression, and we specify the cluster, which is Dyn cluster 1. And then here's the key part, the listen address. Because it's a template, it's something that has to work for every instance that's going to be based on the server, on the template. And so here what we've done is we've got most of it hard-coded, 192.0.2.2. And then here we've got $ID, which is a macro that will translate to your server ID. So whatever server ID, the first server that starts up this will be a 1, the second one will be a 2, and so on. So the first server that starts will be .21 and the second one will be .22. And then you go into your server templates migration tab and you enable automatic server migration. And that's pretty much it for the server template side. Now we get to the dynamic cluster configuration. And you go to Integration tab, and you select which machines are candidates for migrating. So here I've selected both machines as migratable servers. And you specify the migration basis. Here I've listed consensus. When we get into the demo, it's going to be database. And the reason for that is consensus requires a certain number of machines to run. Otherwise, it can run into a situation where it thinks it's not part of the majority cluster, and your servers will have a problem starting up. So in my small environment, database, we see this work better. All right, so here, consensus leasing, and everything's all configured. You can start up your servers, and they'll start up across the machines in your domain, and then everything is configured and ready to go. So at this point, If a machine were to go down or a server and node were to become unavailable, the rest of the domain, the cluster master, and the node manager would take care of migrating the server to a candidate machine. Okay, so here is the starting architecture of the demo. I've got two machines, and I've got a dynamic cluster configured across the machines. Each machine has a node manager running, and we've got server 1 that I start up first that's going to be the cluster master, server 2 that's going to start up on the other machine, and I've also got JMS servers and a distributed destination configured to also show that JMS works on whole server migration on dynamic clusters as well. And here is the after. And in the after situation, we've got machine 2 here. You see the big X. I don't actually attach the machine in my demonstration because my database is running on that machine, and I would have a real hard time migrating it. Everything would break. So what I do instead is I kill the node manager and the server so that the machine effectively becomes unreachable by WebLogic on the other machine. And then we let automatic server migration take place. The cluster master will check the database leasing table, see that server 2's lease expired, and it will work with the node manager to start that server up again on machine 1. Okay, are you guys able to see my mouse pointer? Thank you. Okay. So what I have here is I've got an admin server running already, and this is all configured. It's we're going to go through all the configuration points and just follow one thing at a time. So here, this is machine 1. This window over here represents machine 1, and this window represents machine 2. So over here, we've already got a domain configured, and we're looking at preliminary steps. And one of the things we needed to do was to configure your operating system user. And my user is Oracle. That's the one I use to administer my domain and WebLogic. And so I need to su to root. And I need to go into the sudoers file, and I need to configure Oracle to run the ifconfig and arping commands. And I also have it configured to not require a password, so Node Manager can execute this in a scripted way. And over here on machine 2, because you need to do this for all of the node managers on every machine. So here I just kind of did a shortcut, and I gave Oracle access to all commands, not just ifconfig and arping. Obviously, the best practice is to isolate the number of commands that can be executed by root. So this would be the non-best practice example. And then what we can do is we can test our dynamic IP configuration. So here on machine 1, I can run sudo eth0 ifconfig, 801 192.02.21. And then I'm going to say netmask and give it a command of up. And then if you run isconfig, you can see that that is now an IP address running on my machine. And now I want to bring it down so I can let Node Manager use it. And see it is indeed no longer available. Okay, so now I've done this in my bash profile. I've configured the path to include my domain's bin server migration folder in it, so that Node Manager, when it runs, has this set in its path and it can run the scripts that are in that folder. And I've done that on both machines. Along with some other commands. And so I've already sourced them. I'm going to source them now, but at this point you'd want to source them because we're going to, at least in our Node Manager windows, I've titled them as Node Manager, so they're easy to see. And so now we're going to check out the Node Manager.properties for each one of these. I've already got that open over here. And most of the configuration is all set up properly. The listen address is set up for host 01, which is machine 1, and the port set. The only thing I really had to configure here was what we saw on the presentation, where I specify the interface and then the IP address pool for our floating IP addresses and the net mask. And I've done the same thing over here. And I use the same pool of addresses because I'm not starting a bunch of machines across here. I'm only using 2, but it would support all the way up to 10 of them, I suppose. But those IP addresses can run on either one of these machines, so the configuration is the same. So after that, we start the Node Manager on each machine. Notice I'm in the domain. This OBE folder is my domain home, and then I'm in the bin folder. Start Node Manager up on both machines, and you're going to say that it started. And then we can create the database leasing table. So Oracle WebLogic comes with a script to make this easy to execute. As long as you know where it's located. And like a good little script, it dropped the table and recreated it. Now we want to go into the WebLogic console and start configuring everything up in there. So first thing we're going to do is go into server templates. We've got our server template configured here. I'm starting with a listen port of 8,000. Let's take a look at its configuration here. Oops, going a little too fast. All right, so like I said, I've got the calculated listen port starting at 8,000, so that means my first server that starts up is going to be 8001. And here, I've set it up for the dynamic cluster, as you can see here. And then the listen address is hard-coded except for this $ID macro part. And again, that makes it so that our first server that starts up will be IP address .21 and the other one will be .22. We go into its migration tab, and you would enable automatic server migration. And then in clusters, we can go to our dynamic cluster and see what its settings are. So we're basing it on that template we just saw. Moves too fast. Okay. So here's that template that we saw. I've got it set up to only run 2 servers, so we're going to have one server on each machine, server 1 on machine 1, server 2 on machine 2. And here's the server prefix name that I've picked. So I chose DYN to show that it's a dynamically created server, and serve to show that it's a server. So it'll be dyneserv1, dyneserv2 will be the name of our servers. I've configured calculated listen ports and machine associations, and our match expression is machine star, mock star. So the first machine is defined as machine 1, and the second machine is defined as machine 2. Okay, so that will cause the server to appear on each machine. We go to its migration tab. You see I've got machine 1 and machine 2 selected as candidate machines for migration. Migration is set up as database, and I've already configured all of the infrastructure for JMS and JDBC to work for this. The name of the table is active, that's the default name, and everything is all configured there. So maybe just want to show a little bit more about some of that. So I've got this JDBC data source 0. It's targeted to the cluster, the dynamic cluster. And it's a non-XA data source. I'll explain that in a minute if you're not already aware. And then I've created a persistent store, and I'm using a JDBC store. So I've got also targeted to the dynamic cluster, and it's using that data source that I just told you about. And because we're using it as a persistent store and it's going to be used by the JMS server, the JMS server is an XA resource manager. So you have to use a non-XA data source when you're configuring the data source for a persistent store, because otherwise that would make the JDBC data source an XA resource manager as well, and kind of be a conflict. Okay, so coming back out of that tangent, we come over here to JMS servers. So I've got JMS server 0, and it is using that persistent store and also targeted to the dynamic cluster. And I've got JMS module, and I've got a distributed queue configured. And I've got a sub-deployment that has the targeting to that JMS server that I just showed you. And we've got a couple of queues defined in here. It's a distributed queue, so it automatically creates these queues across the domain. They're not started, so nothing's showing here now. Okay, just getting to the actual testing part now. All right, so now that everything is configured, now we just need to start our server. So I'm going to start with server 1 just to make sure that it becomes the cluster master. And you can see over here in the Node Manager window that Node Manager activated that IP address for the first server on this machine. And you get a status message about it being successful. And we come back here and wait for the server to start. I could theoretically start the other one at the same time now, but I just don't want to take a chance of it starting up faster for strange reason. All right, looks like the first one's running. Now we're going to start the second one. And once again, we see our dynamic IP address being activated and enabled over here on this machine. All right, looks like that one's running now too. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to go to my clusters. I'm going to go to the dynamic cluster. And here you can see that dyneserve1, well, they're both running, but dyneserve1 that's running on machine 1 is the cluster master. And now what we're going to do is place a couple of messages. I don't have an application for this. I'm just using the built-in admin functionality for this. But if we go to the JMS module to our distributed queue, monitoring tab brings us to different queues that were automatically generated for the distributed destination. And if I select the one for server 2, you can see the name in there, and show messages, you see we don't have any messages in there. I can create one. And there we go. A message with a little timestamp is on there. Okay, so what I want to do here is I'm going to just clear these windows so that we can see new messages and it's clear to see what's going on when something happens. And like I said before, I'm not going to actually crash this machine because my database is running on it. So what I'm going to do instead is I've got a script that I've created that will just automatically kill all Java processes on the machine. And you can see that the node manager script over here failed. And if I run JPS, you see that there are no Java processes running on there except for JPS itself. So the fact that this machine is no longer visible to the domain. And now we have to wait a bit to start seeing migration messages appear over here. And we can also go into servers, and you see that the state for Dyn server 2 is unknown, and that it's not reachable. And it does take a little bit of time. There we go. Now Node Manager over here is doing its thing. It's setting up the server to run on this machine. And you see that it's generated successfully the .22 IP address. And now we should see that the server is starting. There we go. I can also go into the OBE folder. We can monitor the migration. So here we've got this server is in the process of migrating from machine 2 to machine 1. And over here it says it is running now, which we can verify. There we go. And we can go into JMS modules, back into system module, and we'll still be able to see our message that we created before on the queue. And that's it. Rebecca, back to you. Okay, are there any questions? Okay, I was just giving time for it to go in the chat. Okay, if there aren't any questions, then that's it for today's session. Thank you very much. See you next time, everybody.